It's my pleasure to introduce our closing keynote, Dr. Nick Haddad. And just coincidence, Nick was my undergraduate ecology professor when I was at North Carolina State University, which I think was one of his first years teaching when he was a professor. But Nick is one of those people that has had the privilege of studying with some of the most eminent ecologists of our time, like Paul Ehrlich and Dave Tillman, too. And what was so great about being in his class, so Nick studies conservation. He studies landscape conservation, how habitats are connected together and how it impacts species' ability to move across landscapes and what it means for their conservation, as well as a whole bunch of different things. And butterflies has been one of his study tracks. And he caught me at a time as a professor where I was in wildlife ecology, if you notice my pen, studying how we conserve things like endangered birds. And at that time, I was like working in an entomology department, and the only thing we did was kill things. And to have an ecologist bring to light this historical context of really foundational theoretical disciplines into something that reached out to me, I think you can all agree had an impact on me. And so Nick is currently a professor at Michigan State University. He's the director of the Kellogg Biological Station Long Term Ecological Research Station, which is helping that whole network and to detect how our biodiversity is changing through time into some of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss, like climate change and agricultural, like industrialized agriculture. And he's trying to do something about it, and he talks about it. He even wrote a book about his perspective on some of our rarest butterflies and the conservation challenges that they face. He's also a fellow of the Ecological Society of America, of the Aldo Leopold Foundation, and of the American Society for the Advancement of Science. So thanks so much, Nick, for being here today and for sharing with us what your perception of the decline of butterflies is. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, thanks, everybody. And I just want to say what an honor it is to be here. I was thinking back to thinking about this conference, this summit, in perspective of all the academic and other conservation meetings, conferences I've been to in the last 35 years. And I can say with all honesty, this is the most interesting, exciting one I have ever been to. And why do I say that? I'm thinking back, I think about our talks over the last 2 days, and I'm thinking, all right, on a scale of 10, how would I grade them? And I grade everyone a 10. I think you all agree, they were incredible talks, right? And then, but even more than that, you all, the vibe here is just so, excited and interested and engaged about doing the real on-the-ground conservation. And that's the kind of thing that, puts the wind in the sails of people like me. And then there's the icing on the cake, and that is that I teach introductory ecology. I've done so for 25 years. I have 200 people in my class every year. And don't say this beyond this room, but I can name 5 of those 2,000 people. But Adrian is one. And I mean, he's from my first class. And in my first class, I knew he was going to go on and do great things, but you never see the people, what they actually do. And now this whole time I'm sitting in the audience starstruck to see all the great things Adrian is doing. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity. So I know we're the last talk of the day, and I'm just going to start by leaving you with one message, and that is, we have the science in hand to know the scale of the problem and the solutions that can be implemented at scale. And we've been hearing that through the last couple of days, but there is no time to equivocate about needing the new science to make important decisions. We need to make the decisions now. And I'm seriously distressed, and at every stage I get more distressed, but then I also like Adrian and then last night Emily said, are we seriously going to end this summit on a talk title like that? And so I got the word solutions in, but I really did have solutions incorporated. I was asked to talk just a little bit about how I got into this, my history, and I will tell you that as an undergraduate, I knew I was going to study birds. Loved work with birds and their conservation. But after work in my undergraduate lab, the lab gave me this opportunity to go study for 2 years in Guatemala in conservation. And I thought, wow, you know, I get to work in some remote forest of Guatemala for 2 years. Like, who won't take that opportunity? But I wasn't really thinking about what I'd be doing. And I didn't think about it like in sincerity until I was dropped off in the forest with 3 things: a tent, a bike to get around the forest, and a butterfly net. And they dropped me there knowing I knew nothing about butterflies. And they said, just collect everything. Collect everything and send them back to the experts. So I was there for 2 years doing that. I was good at catching butterflies. And I sent the specimens back, and it was 4 years later that I was sent a paper, and they did make me a co-author on it. I was grateful for that, that told about the 535 butterfly species I'd captured. But then 2 years after that, I got a different paper, and that one was about the 5 new butterfly species, new to science, that I captured. And one of those species was not just a new species, but a new genus. Okay, so this is a lineage that's millions of years old. I mean, I was expecting it to pop up in one of Talia's fossils yesterday, but I don't know if it did, but millions of years old. And so then I like reading the paper about this new genus and species. And you read all about the description of, you know, what it looks like compared to other things. And there's key criteria related to dissection of genitalia and what they look like compared to others. But what I'm looking for is not like the details, but what's this thing going to be named, right? I mean, come on. I'm like on the edge of my seat. What is this going to be named? And I get to the end, and I kid you not, this is the name, the mediocre butterfly. And so anyway, still a cool name, but it's what it was. And who was asking about skippers here? Like, and Christian said something about how if you look at them closely, they're beautiful. I'm not sure about this one, but anyway, you could be the judge. So, all right, so I'm gonna just take up, just say one thing about one project I've done, which I do think about when I'm at the Pollinator Summit, right? And we've heard all these talks about butterflies. And so, I mean, the question is, like, are butterflies pollinators? I get that question all the time. So I worked with a former postdoctoral student, Sarah Cusser, who looked at pollinators of cotton, where she did the hard work of following all the individual species of pollinators on cotton plants, hours during each day, days during each year, and over years. Like, it is meticulous work. And what she found was summarized in an article in the journal Science. This was just a news story about it, that butterflies pollinate places on cotton plants at times of day and at times of years that bees will never pollinate. So in the state of Texas alone, butterflies are worth $100 million of cotton production. And so butterflies are important pollinators. Yeah, of course, bees are, you know, preeminent, but they're still important, and they fold nicely into this symposium. So, you know, Adrian has brought up a couple times, I wrote this book, The Last Butterflies, about the rarest butterflies in the world, and I'll talk a little bit about those later. And when I got this book in a draft and the editor had this title on it, I thought, oh, maybe this is like, I mean, it seems like over the top, but a way to sell books. But honestly, I think this book, this title is like too optimistic given what we're seeing now. I mean, it's really distressing. So let me just put the context of my work in a history, and you've seen, like, I think every picture along a timeline you've seen at some point in the last couple of days. So I started writing this book in 2013, and just after that, the lowest population of eastern migratory monarchs was found, down by 97% from their peak. And then other information came out, like loss of other insects. So Rodolfo D'Urso had an important paper on defaunation in the Anthropocene, looking at decline across butterflies and other Lepidoptera and other invertebrates. And then the kind of beat kind of went on. There was an important paper in 2017 where in German forests, they found a 70% loss in biomass of insects over a 30-year period. And then I published The Last Butterflies, but also got involved in thinking about regional decline using citizens, community science programs that I'll talk about in a minute. But in Ohio, butterflies were declining by 2% per year over decades. And this wasn't just true for butterflies. Other information came out about the rest of insects, and it was all consistent, right? And finally, people started thinking about what are the causes. If we're seeing general decline, there has to be general causes. And so that's the kind of ground that I'm going to be tackling today. And so the way the my talk is structured is around 3 problems, and they're like, you can read them, but they're big problems in loss of butterflies and I think other insects. And then 3 solutions, and the solutions are big and can happen now. And we've heard some of that earlier today in the last couple of days. So first I want to tell you about work we did on the populations of and diversity of butterflies across the United States. And I think this is now the definitive study of what's happening to butterflies in the United States. And the cool thing about the study is we were able to take advantage of community science data. And this is just a picture to represent, especially on the right, like that there are standard methods that people use to count butterflies. And when I say people, I'm not talking about scientists, but people that can walk a path for a mile and do it maybe once a week or once every other week or once a month, and then do that over years and find something out about the butterflies. And that's true in many places, but including right here in Colorado. And I was in the community science session before lunch, and so I know for sure that a number of you are involved in collecting data for the state of Colorado. But let me tell you that these are the best data in the world that Colorado and elsewhere that are able to answer big questions about insects and their decline across a whole group of species like Lepidoptera. We cannot do it for other big groups of species, and we cannot do it at scale without the involvement of other people. And a question came up about who could be involved in gathering these data. And I'm confident that every person in this room, if you have enough interest to come to this for 2 days, you have the the interest and ability to learn enough about the butterflies to contribute to the Colorado monitoring program. But it's not just Colorado, it's elsewhere across the US. And what I want to convey before I get to the results is we brought 35 monitoring programs together like the Colorado one. So it's in states and in regions, and it's thousands of individuals doing the work, tens of thousands of surveys, millions of records about butterflies. And I want to emphasize this partly because you all can get involved, but partly because you cannot make up the results that I'm going to show you. It's not just me going out with my lab and how I dictate some program to say something about decline of butterflies. This is a general result across many programs, many people, many butterflies. And this is where I get distressed because the results are bad. Butterflies, we've lost 1/4 of all butterflies in the last 20 years. The trajectory is down. And it's just mind-blowing to me that we can see this. It's true in every region in the country. We did analyses like that. And it's true also for not just abundance of butterflies, but for their diversity. And it's true across species. And now I get to turn to the next graphic. We had the good fortune that New York Times did an article about this work and made a better graph than I could ever make, which is showing the change in abundance of butterflies for every species of butterfly. So if you look towards the middle between the green and the red, there's a 0, right? No change in population. And everything that's red is a declining population. And we find that 2/3 of butterflies in the United States are declining, and they're declining, from a little would be like down by 25% to a lot, 75, 100% declines. I mean, it's huge changes in numbers of butterflies. And I will say, there are some butterflies that are increasing. We could talk about that, but it's such a small number, like the focus has to be on the decline. And the New York Times article did also a nice thing. They took our data and made a tool where any person living anywhere in the United States can type in their city and find out about the butterflies that are declining where they are. So I did this morning for Boulder, Colorado, and it just flashed up a few species. And so you can look, these are all happen to be declining, but it does all, like this is the first thing that came up this morning, right? And the upper right, cabbage whites are declining. And like cabbage whites are a species that many of you will know of because they're eating your broccoli and cabbage and such. But this is an invasive pest species, and yet its populations are down by 50%. Like if cabbage whites can't make it, I mean, good God. Okay, so there's a problem, right? And then the problem goes to a second part, what is the cause of insect decline? And to me, this is one of the most important questions in biological sciences because the decline is so rapid and there's not like an end we're seeing that it will continue to decline, will unravel ecological systems. So you've seen this in the last couple of days. First, the cause of decline has to be general. It cannot be some specific thing in every space. I mean, of course there are specific causes, but there has to be something general going on in the background. And the end of every paper about butterfly decline will say, oh, well, there's probably one of 3 big reasons. And the big 3 reasons are habitat loss, climate change, and increased use of insecticides. But it's a hard nut to crack to arbitrate between those 3 causes. So I was fortunate to join a team where we were able to compare these threats apples to apples to apples for these same butterfly data, but in the US Midwest, because we could get all the needed data to do the tests. So all those blue places on this map are places we had long-term butterfly data. We also could get long-term temperature precipitation data. Well, any of us can do that because those are easily accessible on the web. We could get data on habitat use and how it's changing, which also is pretty accessible. But what's almost impossible to get is data on pesticides. And we were able to get data on all classes of pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides in these same counties. And I'll come back to this, but through the year 2014. They are not accessible since then. Nonetheless, we could compare the threats apples to apples to apples. And I want to interject with a key change that comes in agricultural technologies. So before 1995, the key pesticides were pyrethroids and organophosphates that were applied when there was a problem. And then in 1995, there's a big shift to treating before there's a problem with either BT-treated seeds or with seed coatings of insecticides that we heard about, you saw nice pictures of earlier. And so the key difference is we've moved from reactive treatment for pest insects to prophylactic use of insecticides. And as Lena told us this morning, every corn seed, whether or not there's a problem across really the world, has insecticides on it. So like in the US Midwest, that's 100 million acres that's being saturated with insecticides. Okay, so I'm just gonna show you a quick result just to say how we know that insecticides rise to the top as the cause of decline. And so what this graphic is showing is, excuse me, the change in number of species of butterflies. That's the black line relative to a baseline of 0. And the way this analysis works is comparing with some alternative past where the level of insecticides stays the same in 1997 throughout the time period relative to the changes that we see through today. And so insecticides cause a decline by this kind of analysis in species richness and in abundance of insects by like closing in on 10%. Excuse me. And it's true with these overall metrics, but also specifically for monarchs. And so monarchs are a key, insecticides are a key threat that we need to pay attention to. There's a whole bunch of different analyses that are associated with this, but I really just want to leave you with the key message that insecticides rise to the top in the apples to apples comparison with land use change and with climate change as the cause of decline for abundance of butterflies, for diversity of butterflies, and including specifically, we looked at monarchs. Okay, so then I did want to say one thing about implications of this work before closing out the insecticides, and that is that I told you we have data through 2014. So since 2014, butterflies continue to decline. We have no insecticide data, and we have other global changes happening, right? Like the hottest years on record. But we can't do the apples to apples comparison anymore. So what I'm going to assert is that without the ability to test effects of decline in more recent years, the best available science is that insecticides are causing the decline. And really, like insecticide companies and the government, they're like shooting themselves in the foot by not providing the data to say, oh, there may be some alternative cause. Okay, the last problem, also a big one, is that species are being lost. And when I wrote the last butterflies, that's what I was thinking most about, was the rarest butterflies in the world. And I'm going to tell you just about a couple of them that I've worked on. One is called the St. Francis Satyr, and for most of the time I worked on it, there were about 3,000 of these butterflies. And so 3,000 butterflies, I don't know if that seems like a big or small number to you, but if you gathered them all together and squished them into a ball, it would be like this many butterflies, right? So it's almost nothing. And the range of this butterfly is in blue on this map, and just take a quick look. There is a blue dot in southern North Carolina. And it turns out the location is an army installation. And here I am with a smile on my face because in this shot, I'm near about 30 of these butterflies. And I told you there might have been 3,000, but I have an especially big smile because in this army base, the butterfly populations are centered in a bomb range, and I've like made it through the bomb range to see these butterflies. But I was called in to ask, as a conservation biologist, how would we do conservation for this butterfly? And I was charged with monitoring populations outside the bomb ranges. And these letters and numbers don't mean anything, they're just designations for different populations. And what I saw them doing is disappearing before my eyes. And I had taken this approach of being like hands off, let nature take its course, and you know the ship will be righted, and that was not happening. And like to me, that really impressed on me my arrogance and ignorance as a conservation biologist, ecologist, to like see the conservation done well. But just to tell you a little bit about the butterfly, it's maintained by disturbance. Like somebody asked about the importance of fire for butterflies. In this case, fire is important to keeping out the plants that the butterfly's not using. It's using a sedgy plant, and shrubs and trees will overgrow it without fire or other disturbance. These butterflies live on wetlands, and it turns out beavers help to maintain those wetlands. And so we've done a lot of work to try to restore the butterfly's habitat. We take the approach of trying to simulate effects of beavers, and Like the best tool in my toolbox is a butterfly net, but the second best is this thing called an aquadam, where it's kind of like an inner tube where you can roll it out and then make it the size that you want using water from the stream. And we're trying to create saturated wetlands where this butterfly lived. And we thought we were really onto something. So we were working in restoration on one population that where the butterfly was initially discovered and where it was lost, and then it wasn't seen for a couple decades. And then we came in and did our restoration, and we seeded in a few butterflies and saw the population grow. And I told you earlier that we'd known of about 3,000 butterflies for this butterfly, and we were restoring hundreds of butterflies, like a big fraction of the total world population. So I was feeling pretty good about applying new knowledge to conservation, and then the population fell off the cliff. And this was in one experimental population, but it happened elsewhere too in this small range of the butterfly, including in the bomb ranges that we thought were the safety nets for this butterfly. And so we've seen now 2 individuals since 2022. Realistically, it could be extinct. And so I've worked on other rare butterflies, like this is the Miami blue that used to be found throughout South Florida and then was found down in very South Florida, including the Keys. By 1990, there were 5 populations distributed in South Florida, but then they started to disappear. And they were thought to go extinct when Hurricane Andrew came through in 1992. Luckily, the populations were rediscovered, so we thought there was a new start. But again, it's not been seen since September 2022. And then finally, I'll tell you about a butterfly I haven't worked on, the Lang's meadowlark that's found in the San Francisco Delta. It's always had small populations, but it's also been not seen since 2022. And I think a point I'd like to impress is that this is the leading edge of extinction. There are 28 US endangered species. I'm telling you about 3 that might be extinct right now, but I'm also telling you that butterflies in general are declining fast, so it's not surprising to see the rarest butterflies being lost. Okay, so then I want to, before switching, I will talk about butterflies, but I do want to say that I think butterflies are indicators for the rest of the insect world. And so I love this quote from a famous evolutionary ecologist from 1863, where Bates said, "As the laws of nature must be the same for all beings, the conclusions furnished by butterflies must be applicable to the whole organic world. Therefore, the study of butterflies, creatures selected as the types of airiness and frivolity, will someday be valued as one of the most important branches of biological sciences." And take that for what it's worth, but I think in studies of insect declines or status, the status of insects across the world, we can just know more about butterflies than we can about any other big group of pollinators. And all the data that we have, which is much smaller than we have for butterflies, corresponds to what we're seeing with the butterflies. Okay, now I need to just say one thing about my story arc. So I don't know if you think about this kind of thing or not, but Kurt Vonnegut has 8 ways to tell a story. And so the one way that I never want to be on is the one I'm on now, From Bad to Worse, where the main character starts off poorly, then gets continually worse with no hope for improvement. But I promised Adrian I would not take this story arc. So I'm going to the next one, The Man in the Hole. This is the one I want to be on, where I've already dug myself a deep hole and now want to claw myself back out. And the good news here is that, again, we have you've seen them the last 2 days. We have solutions that can be implemented at scale and at least can hopefully halt the trend in decline or even reverse it. So I'm going to talk about 3 paths towards conservation of butterflies and I think other insects. And I'm going to start with one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about myself, which is targeted restoration for species near extinction. And I've been engaged in conversations here where people are talking about, like, we have a limited amount of resources. Do we think about, like, protecting the common species, or, you know, investing that direction, or really investing heavily in those species that Christian just talked about that are on the verge of extinction? And I am going to argue we want to do both, but, like, different approaches are going to cover a different range of species. So for some species, we can do targeted restoration. And so my lab has worked heavily in this. It turns out that Michigan is a hotspot for the rarest butterflies. We've teamed up with the John Ball Zoo to have hoop houses where we raise a couple of the rarest butterflies in the world. And one of them is called the power-seek skipperling. This is a butterfly that was found from southeast Michigan up to Manitoba, and I'm showing you all these dots are where you could find the butterfly up to early mid-90s, but the red ones are the places where the butterfly's been extirpated since the mid-90s. Like, do we know why? No, we don't know for sure why, but it seems like too much of a coincidence that the timing of the loss of hundreds of populations across hundreds of miles at the time that prophylactic use of insecticides was coming into play, and at the time that the European soybean aphid invaded, doesn't point the finger at insecticides. So the populations that remain, if you happen to see the green dots, are in southeast Michigan and Manitoba, like at the two extremes of the range. And right now, we have more individuals in captivity at the John Ball Zoo than there are in the wild in the world. And so our next steps are to get those back out in places that we can do restoration. We're also doing similar kinds of efforts with the Mitchell satyr that was found in a lot of places in the U.S., in the eastern U.S. Right now, it's found in Michigan and in Alabama and Mississippi. And so now we're thinking about how do we do restoration in a changing climate. And a postdoctoral student of ours is thinking about something called genetic rescue. Can we bring individuals from the south to the north and increase their genetic diversity in ways that help them persist in a changing climate? Okay, so I do think there's an important place for targeted conservation for rare species that are imperiled with, like, near imminent extinction. We have to invest there. But how many species can we do that for? And yet we're seeing hundreds of species declining. So I do think we also have to turn to solutions that address the big problem at scale. And Lena talked about this one yesterday, ending the prophylactic use of insecticides. That is, ending their use when pest insects aren't shown to be a problem. And she went through the details better than I ever can, so I'm just going to show one slide, because it really just kills me to think about insecticide use on corn. So corn, now basically 100% of seeds have seed coatings with this cocktail of insecticides, including neonicotinoids. And as Lena talked about earlier, we hardly can get seeds without these insecticides. But the sad thing is, there's virtually no problem that these are addressing in corn, because the major corn pests are already controlled by BT, traded seeds. And so, as Lena also said this morning, the majority of corn farms gain no economic benefit from putting these pesticides, insecticides onto the seeds, or for the companies doing it. And so here we have a win-win situation for, like, everybody, insects, people, and the world. It's cheaper for farmers or for the producers of seeds. It benefits the environment more generally. It benefits our pollinators. And I have to say, I've just been heartened to see. And there's, you can look at the booth outside, hear Lena's talk, but about, like, legislation is happening in Michigan. And I was on a call about, 8 months ago with Lena and her colleagues about similar progress to be made in Michigan. And sadly, the Michigan efforts are stalled. But so my conversations today and yesterday are about how can we get this back on track and use Colorado as a model to move these programs forward. And so when I see this happening, like it's due to people like Lena, but it's people like you too, because we're all having a voice in seeing policies like this change. Okay, the last one I want to talk to you about is near and dear to my heart in the US Midwest, but it could be applicable to any farmed landscape in the country or the world, and it's opportunities for large-scale conservation that are hidden in plain sight. And so let me just reflect back, going to like graduate school, a postdoc, or earlier on. Like, I'm a conservation biologist, and when I thought about conservation, I thought about conservation of wilderness, right? Like, that's the dream. Places like this, the Kanza Prairie in central Kansas, that's like the end of the tall grass prairie, big tall grass prairie areas. But what do my area and the US Midwest look like now? They look like this, and this is the hope for conservation, that we'll have prairie strips, edge of field conservation, buffers. But the question then is, like if I'm like wanting wilderness conservation, like how meaningful is this in trying to reverse pollinator decline? And I'm gonna tell you right now that I think it can be extremely meaningful, and I'm just gonna show you how in a few slides. So first I wanna tell you, and you don't have to read anything on the next slide, but that we have data on things like corn and soybean yield across the US Midwest from on-farm measures. We have data on soils from across the Midwest US. We have data from remote sensing on yields and other environmental characteristics. So we can understand the dynamics of yield, corn yield and environment across the US. That's what this slide is meant to show. But now I want to zoom down to an individual farm. So here I'm showing a farm that's farmed in corn and soy, and there are places that are high yielding, that are in blue, and that are low yielding in red. And you see that there's some variation from year to year. And we can take these long-term records and ask, are there places in a farm that are particularly good or particularly bad? And it turns out that in many farms, we can easily find places that are doing particularly bad, in fact, so bad that they really should not be farmed and shouldn't be farmed at the benefit to the farmer or to environment or to people. And then, again, I'm back to this problem of, all right, if we're conserving like a quarter acre in a farm or an acre in a farm, like, is that gonna matter to insect conservation? And so now I'm going to go from a farm to a landscape. And this landscape happens to be in Iowa, where all the green in this landscape is consistently under-yielding farmland in the US Midwest. Now I'm going to go to the scale of a county in Iowa. All the green is consistently under-yielding farmland in the US Midwest. Now I'm going to go to the scale of the US Midwest. There's 100 million acres of corn, soy in the US Midwest, 25% of which is consistently under-yielding and should not be farmed. And so, all right, I can say that, but like, what does this look like? Now that I think about this, I'm driving around my farm landscapes, and now it just pops out all the time. These are extreme examples, but you'll see it. There are wet places where they're like tiny stalks of corn growing out of wetlands or former wetlands. Edge of field is a common place where there's either soil compression or there's things running off from the roads or the surrounding landscape that are causing yield to be lower. And if we convert these areas, this is just the US Midwest, to 17 million hectares of conservation areas, then they have all sorts of benefits for biodiversity, for carbon sequestration, for water quality. Now all the excess nitrogen is not going to run off into our water systems, and reduction in insecticides. Like, just on the face of it, insecticides, nitrogen wouldn't be applied to these areas. Now the question that we're all going to ask is, who would do this? Who would just voluntarily take areas out of production? So a graduate student in our program, Rachel Drobnik, asked this question, and she took into account all inputs to farms and then all income that would come from yield. And she actually made a tool that farmers use to ask this question on their own farms. And so what I've got is a graphic that on the horizontal axis shows the proportion of average yield. So going to the right means a lower and lower proportion. And then on the vertical axis is whether a farmer is losing money by turning in, land into prairie conservation or gaining by turning land into prairie conservation. And it turns out that if there's no other incentives, if yield is less than 50% of average yield, a farmer makes money by not farming these areas and converting them to perennials. And then if you incorporate one level of subsidy, which is conservation reserve program payments, then the yield level threshold is 70, about 3/4. And this does not factor in other things like insurance payments and possible distortions introduced through insurance payments. But I guess the point is that there are cases on the landscape that individually are there opportunities for small conservation, but they add up to huge areas that could be conserved for our pollinators and for other benefits to the environment and to farmers. And I will just add one slide to say that I think a lot about conservation on row crop areas, but I'm moving into I'm thinking about others as well. Like we've heard a lot today about pollinator gardens and how they can be important in our basket of activities to conserve pollinators. I've loved hearing about the Flower in a Box program that is just so inspiring and looks like a way to like get native plants on your land. And then Sammy's comment yesterday that basically putting one potted plant out from the hanging out from an apartment on your apartment building affects many bees that might gain resources from it. But I also think there's huge opportunities for conservation on roadsides, for conservation in conjunction with solar arrays. There's possibilities that are hidden in plain sight. Okay, so I'm gonna wind up by starting with, putting up a headline from an article that I read in 2019. And it was in The Economist, and the headline was, "The insect apocalypse is not here, but there are reasons for concern." And then I read through the article, and the last line is that insects are indicators of ecosystem health. Their decline is a warning to pay attention to before it really is too late. And the question I have now, looking at this quote 6 years later, is are we paying attention really? And are we on the verge of being too late? We're getting closer and closer to it. So I think it's a call to action. And I just am so inspired to see like all the important work you're doing and all the talks that I've heard about in the last couple days that like echo things that I've trying to reiterate here, that there are problems that we know already in science. We can no longer equivocate. We know that butterflies are in free fall. That's across the United States and across other places in the world where such monitoring is done. We know that insecticides are a general cause of decline. And we know that butterflies are going extinct, and we're just at the leading edge of it. So that's the problems, but we also have solutions that are in our grasp. Like these aren't things that are, decades away. These are things that can be done now. We can do intensive conservation for the rarest species. We're seeing it in Colorado right now. We can end the prophylactic use of insecticides, and we can do conservation across large scales in areas that make sense for everybody that would be involved in the conservation. So with that, I just have to thank many people who are involved in these studies. I've been fortunate to be associated with big teams. Like Kevin Burrows talked yesterday. He's part of the team that was thinking about the decline, the status of U.S. butterflies, and many others. So thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions or engage in conversation about this stuff.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm going to have executive privilege while you take this around, which is you've worked on some of the most unknown and probably undervalued like taxa in the U.S. and around the world. What do you see as a way that we can connect people to those rarest like species? That's not just a regulatory framework that we've got to do it because the government tells us to, but how do you make people care?
Oh, that's a good question about how to care. I mean, in the end, I can want to make arguments like with pollinators and cotton about ecosystem services or other functional roles that butterflies play in ecosystems as pollinators or as prey. And those are all important reasons. But for the rarest species in the world, like they have no like critical role like that in ecological systems. And so, I mean, honestly, in the end, for me, it comes down to ethical arguments about people not being the cause of extinction of species. Now, at a more local level, like in Michigan, we try to get people into our zoo facilities to see the rare butterflies that they could see if the butterflies were restored on the landscape. And there are places where the endangered Mitchell satyr is accessible by boardwalk to the public to see. But I mean, it's a conundrum because these things are so rare. I mean, Christian talked about it earlier about his difficulty in finding some of these butterflies. They're so rare, like it's hard to even get people like out to see the things, and yeah, it creates a problem.
Hi, thank you. How can the conservation strips, that be successful in restoring butterfly populations if they're still surrounded by all this cropland where insecticides and pesticides are being applied?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's the most common question I get, and I did not plant this question in the audience because I do have 2 more slides to show you. Didn't have a good way to slip them in. But I had a student who asked this question. So we work heavily with prairie strips and asked the question, are these places safe for butterflies or are they ecological traps? And I'm just going to show you this slide and then the next one to cut to the key result, which is that for the butterfly that she studied, the strips were a refuge, not a trap. So she compared what was happening in the strips with reference prairie. And in the strips, the butterflies were more attracted there, so they laid more eggs. That has to be true for a trap to be in place because like the idea of a trap is you're attracting things to places where they might be doing worse. But they actually had lower levels of predation of eggs and larvae. And then I have insecticides at the bottom. I mean, here's like the saddest thing, going to your question, the saddest thing of all. In our reference prairie, there's no difference in insecticide compared to the strips right next to agriculture. I mean, it like sends chills down my spine that we're saturating in our environments, even the places that are removed from agriculture. So I think right now, I mean, of course, like we'd want bigger areas, but populations are doing so poorly that there has to be habitat put back out on the landscape. And the best we know, and of course, there always has to be more work done, but I think the best we know now is that these places can be valuable in conservation. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation. We hear a lot about the big 3, the pesticides, the habitat destruction, climate change. Another thing that seems correlated with butterfly declines has been the invasive European paper wasp. And has that been looked at? Because there's a correlation there too. In the 1970s, it got to this country. In Colorado, it got here around 2000, 2001. And back when we opened the butterfly pavilion, there were butterflies all over the outside gardens there. And then 2001, 2002, suddenly they're disappearing. I know the caterpillars are sitting ducks for paper wasps. Has there been work on that?
This is a great point, and I don't have an answer to your specific question. I'm sure people have looked at it. So I want to make 2 points here. One is that there for sure are other local causes of decline. What I'm making the argument is that to see this wide-scale decline, like across the whole country or across the world, there has to be general causes. But then there are specific causes to it. I cannot speak to that one. The other thing, a point I should have made is that there is an issue with time scale in what I'm saying is the cause, which is insecticide, because the period I'm looking at declines over the last 30 years, which is when we have the data, is also the time when prophylactic use of insecticides has come into play. Whereas, like in the US Midwest where I live, habitat loss happened in the mid-1800s, right? And so that for sure caused large-scale decline. And so as my student Erica reminded me a few days ago, if we don't have the habitat there in the first place, then we're never going to recover these butterflies. And so that's, yeah, so I do think there's a paired strategy of seeing more conservation and seeing reduction in insecticides. Other questions? Way back. We're making you run, Adrian.
Has there been any work done in the idea of, when you're talking about taking unproductive farmland out of production, trying to figure out if would that correlate like with the lands that are the worst for growing a crop, let's say, be necessarily viable habitat for particular butterflies? And are there, anything as far as pieces of land and their size and their proximity to other pieces of land where they could act as stepping stones for populations that are moving, or just having enough room for genetic transfer to happen?
So there's a lot of questions tied up in your big question, but in terms of the big question, I haven't done work on prioritization, and that's the next stage, because we're not going to see 17 million hectares conserved instantaneously, and there have to be places that are better than others. And so that could either focus on, if we're going to conserve 1 million or 10 million acres, where would be the best place that conserves the most biodiversity? But then those areas have to be supplemented. When I look at the map across the US Midwest from at the scale I showed you all, I see a big corridor running across the whole region. And I've studied corridors for longer than I've studied butterflies, and so that is very heartening to me. But there are gaps. That's what you're bringing up. And so then where do we have to supplement? The thing that I do think drops through the cracks in this approach that I'm telling you is I'm not hopeful that's going to be the way to conserve the rarest species. I'm hopeful that that's going to conserve the common species that we're also seeing decline at a very rapid rate. But the conservation of the rare species, I work in butterflies in wetlands, for example. The two in Michigan I work with are associated with wetlands. There's other kinds of conservation that need to be done. But yes, I'm kind of giving you the first level of, I think there are big areas that can be, are ripe for conservation, but there's important work that needs to be done as well.
Certainly is interesting and disappointing that there's not more care for the life of butterflies, but we also might wonder why there is not more care for the health of human beings, which is affected by the same problems. And so if I ask myself that question, it seems like money and politics, that there are economic pressures that are pushing these poisons into our environment that really are hurting us.
Yeah, and so that's a great comment. I don't have anything to add except I loved hearing John's talk earlier today that, made, it was following a similar thread except farther to human health. He's talking about regenerative agriculture. I'm talking about regenerative agriculture. We're talking about fundamentally the same process, but I loved how he brought it that next step to how does it affect people in a bigger, more cosmic way. Pollinators for human health are themselves important, but there's other aspects of human health that are affected.
So going off of one of the last few questions about identifying that agricultural land that could be co-opted for this purpose instead, was there any identification of what is purchased or what is owned by private family farmers versus big industrial agricultural complex?
No, I haven't. My colleague Bruno Basso, who led the remote sensing effort, he does work with both, but yeah. I mean, I guess the next level is, if it makes financial sense for at either level, then it should be a more general response. But we do surveys. I run a long-term ecological research site that does surveys across the U.S. Midwest of farmers, not just individual surveys in a given year, but across many years, across decades. And that would be one way that we could enter in, by asking those questions. We do ask questions about prairie strips and other regenerative agriculture, but we'd have to get at that question specifically.
Last one.
Hey, Nick, great talk. I'm curious, so when you did the analysis trying to evaluate, the three causes and which might be most prominent, the regional focus was probably the most intensive agricultural part of the U.S. I'm curious, if you've been able to do that regional analysis. I would expect a similar pattern in California, for example, but in the Intermountain West, I might expect that a different factor would emerge as the winner of causing the greatest declines. And so then the conservation and restoration strategies might be different in those different regions. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I have a number of thoughts, but I will point, I didn't put the QR code up, but Kevin Burrell's talked yesterday. I should have made more links between our two talks, that we took the the science paper, which kind of condenses everything into one short format, to the big patterns, with the Xerces Society leading and others involved from our paper, to break it down to regional questions about what are the threats and what are the concerns. Because you're right, it's not the same thing everywhere, but I still do think that, so there is for sure variation, and we have to be thinking about different problems in different places. But I do think there are some big threats that are also ubiquitous, like use of saturating our environment with insecticides.
Okay, I lied. One more.
Well, this is actually a comment, but listening, I mentioned to John Lundgren that paralleling everything being presented during these 2 days, there's a corresponding conversation going on in international public health, and which really is so consistent with what is being talked about here, with the focus on pollinators. And a journalist put that conversation into one sentence. He said, "The future of health will be planetary," meaning caring for the planet, caring for the whole biosphere, or there will be no future health, period. And I think getting that message across, it was certainly there in Lena's talk from NRDC, but there's parallels between deteriorating human health and ecosystem health.
I will say one thing, so that's a great comment, and we have done an analysis. This is led by a group at Stanford called the Natural Capital Project that thinks about the value of nature for people. And I was lucky to be involved in their analysis, global analysis of the value of pollinators for people, and how loss of pollinator habitat near crops that are pollinated would affect human health around the world. And it is devastating. We looked at 217 pollinated crops around the world, and looking at their nutrient content and how those crops are related to local communities around the world, and the loss is astounding. So, I mean, that's just one aspect, pollinators, but pollinators play an important part in what you're saying.
Awesome. Let's all give Nick another round of applause. Thanks so much, Nick.